I'm going to start off and then I shall hand over to you. Welcome to everyone for our final webinar panel. Peter, you may wish to turn off your video until you are talking. This last one is Generative AI, what do researchers need to know now? I'm Margaret Bierman. I'm from the Centre for Research and Assessment in Digital Learning, and really would like to welcome you to this final webinar co-hosted by Texa on the implications of generative AI for higher education. So, before I begin, as always, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded land, skies and waterways on which Deakin students and teachers come together. And as we learn and teach through virtually and physically constructed places across time, we pay our deep respect to the ancestors and elders of Wadawurrung country, Eastern Ma country and Wurundjeri country, as well as the traditional custodians of all the lands on which you may be learning and teaching. My own place that I live and work is Boonwurrung country, and where education has taken place for many thousands of years. And I think it's always so timely in a discussion about generative AI to remember that education precedes us and will go on for many years to come. This is the fourth in a series of webinars. First one in February, was it? ChatGPT, what do we need to know now? Then how should educators respond? And then recently, what have we learned as the world is starting to come to grips with what this change means? And finally, we turn our attention to research and research training, something that had less immediate attention, but as I'm certainly, since I've been talking to folk about this webinar, realising the huge implications for research as well. And for me, this is a really exciting webinar. It's really going into a territory that I hadn't really thought much about prior. So I'm going to be brief. Use the Q&A, not the chat. The Q&A will be monitored. Please use the voting function to upvote each Q&A question, because we often have more questions than we can answer. We'll use the upvote ones to see how they'll go. We won't take questions during the first hour, but we'll come to an open Q&A at the end. The chat, which is mostly unmonitored, although Cradle colleagues will be popping in at various points. And we will not redistribute the chat, so you can say what you wish, but only the links within it. So if you do post a link, we'll distribute those. And you can use Twitter. And I believe the wonderful Joanna Ty will be live tweeting as she usually does. And I can see there's a question in the Q&A, which is anticipated. Frequently asked questions, fourth time around. Is this recorded? Yes, it will be available on YouTube. Will the slides be made available? With presenter approval, we'll make slides available. Not all our presenters have slides. Will the chat be made available? No, only the links within the chat will be circulated. And is this webinar shorter? Yes, it's only 90 minutes. So without much further conversation, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass over to Professor Peter Coldrake, who is the Chief Commissioner of Texa, to give some insights into why Texa wanted this webinar and what their interest in the area of research and research integrity is. So Peter, passing over to you if you want to put on your video.
Can you hear me now, Margaret?
Beautifully.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Margaret. I acknowledge you and your centre, Cradle and Deakin, for organising, doing the hard work with this particular webinar, and of course for your broader leadership in this space. Like you, I join with the acknowledgement of our First Nations people. I thank in advance our panellists today and the contribution that each of you are making as we all think through these issues together, and people like you, of course, taking the lead. It's also really good to have such a good roll-up of people participating in the conversation, and we thank you for your interest and the commitment that you have. And of course, I acknowledge the folk at Texa, particularly the higher education Integrity Unit led by Helen Ganil, who have mobilised a lot of our activity. As Margaret has said, this is the fourth in this series of webinars. And the first two, as she said, focused really on things arising in the teaching and learning space out of the release of ChatGPT last November, seems quite a long time ago. And the third one dealing with some of the lessons that had been collectively learnt. It has been increasingly obvious that we actually hitherto haven't been focusing as much, or at all really, on some of the huge implications in the research-related space, research and research training space, and that's what we're seeking to do today. And I'm strictly an amateur in this space, and I'm looking forward to staying on for a couple of hours and listening to what everyone has to say and to learning a few things. And I thank you very much for your contribution. To respond to Margaret's invitation, I should sort of explain Texa's interest. At a general level, our interest goes to Texa's two key functions. One of those is to do whatever we can to protect the quality and integrity of the Australian higher education system. And the second, of course, is to support and protect the interests of students, most particularly, of course, research-related students in the context of today's topic. That's the general interest of Texa. At a more specific level, we have an interest because of our obligation in respect of the higher education standards framework. And higher education standards framework is often recited and quoted and so on in terms of, standard 4.2 and so on. But I think we need to understand what the higher education standards framework is. It is basically a set of principles to guide the activities of providers, institutions, universities, and other institutions of higher education, a set of principles about how they should be operating in the various domains that are covered by those standards. The standards themselves are not meant, and I don't think are prescriptive, but they do draw some lines in the sand about matters which are important. For example, the standards don't tell institutions how they will implement a culture or in what form they'll implement a culture of research integrity, but they do say that any institution engaged in research is responsible for developing such a culture and maintaining it and fostering it. In other words, the standards framework itself is an important set of principles, and I've got no doubt that and it's supposed to be dynamic and itself operating in a dynamic environment. The standards that are most particularly relevant, of course, today are those to do with postgraduate research students, research training, intellectual property, and research integrity. And we'll hear a lot about those this morning. The other thing I'd just say about where this sort of webinar fits is that when people think of the role of regulators, and in the context of higher education, the role of Texa in particular, they oftentimes think of us as a bunch of people in black hats. I think it's important to understand that we have a very important white hat role. Most people, almost all people, one would assume, who operate in the higher education sector, particularly in leadership positions in it, wish to jealously guard the reputation of their institutions and jealously protect the interests of their own students. In fact, we all have those obligations. So in the context of this particular webinar, what we're seeking to do is to familiarise ourselves as close as we can with the terrain we're dealing in. Our role is to our responsibility is to work with experts in the field, such as those people who are with us today. Our role is to gather experience and learn the lessons from other jurisdictions and share best practice, both domestically and internationally. And as you probably know, Texa's tied up with international collaboration, the Global Academic Integrity Network, GAIN. And so we're really interested in building our knowledge base, the experience base, the knowledge of best practice and so on. And we think good regulatory model and good regulatory practice follows that. There is no way that Texa is in a position from a standing start to say, well, this is how we're going to regulate AI. Of course not. But we do have to listen to what the experts say. We do have to share practice, learn from other jurisdictions, and develop our regulatory approach on that basis. And it's in that spirit, I think, that Texa has such a close commitment and engagement to what we're doing here and to learning from the experts today in respect of research integrity, research students, and so on. And I look forward to the contribution of each of our 4 panellists, and I'll pass back to you, Margaret, and thank you for convening the day.
Well, my absolute pleasure. And I'm really also looking forward to hear, I think from today, we will get a sense of how to build, you know, the culture of research integrity about what's important and what isn't. So we now move to the panelists, and we have 4 panelists, Matt Cooper-Holtz, Dr. Nietzsche Philipson, Dr. Simon Knight, and Professor Justin Zobel, or Zobel possibly. I'll start with Matt. I'll introduce everyone as they turn up. Matt is an adjunct professor with Deakin Business School, an artificial intelligence scientist, and advisor with over 30 years in the field. Actuarial science and computer science, an unusual combination. And Matt is an absolute leader and one of Australia's leading AI scientists. So we're very pleased to have him here today. Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, everyone, for having me. I will share some slides. I think it's a very important scene setter to consider that AI and even generative AI is not simply one thing, but rather an enormous, rapidly growing discipline that's actually been around since the 50s or 60s and is changing as a result of the exponential forces at play in both computing power, in communications technologies, the ability to move data around, in the amount of data itself is growing exponentially, and a number of other technologies where the output is not pegged to the input means we're in an environment where there's 2 sayings that I would like to put up to start with. The first is from Arthur C. Clarke, which talks to the fact that if you show anyone a sufficiently advanced technology, it's going to be indistinguishable from magic. And you can imagine showing a mobile phone to some ancient tribe and them just not understanding how this shiny piece of glass is able to make music and sounds and record pictures and do all the fantastic things it can do. Now, even as a practitioner of AI and sort of on the tools almost every day for 30 years, I've got to say my recent experiences with the developments in generative AI have, to me, seemed almost indistinguishable from magic. And the efficiency gain, especially as someone that is often cutting code and working technically alongside these technologies as a tool, has been absolutely incredible. The other point worth mentioning, because these are exponential technologies, is a saying from Matthew Bishop, the editor of The Economist, who said the pace of change has never been this rapid, nor will it be this slow again. So we're in a very, very quickly developing and moving environment. We're in an environment where we can't point to one thing alone and say that is generative AI, but rather we're talking about an amalgam of different technologies, all of which are moving at an exponential pace. And this is going to lead to enormous disruption across a number of sectors, not the least of which the education sector, especially as we see the adoption of these technologies at a pace faster than ever before. The amount of time it took ChatGPT to hit 1 million registered users was faster than any other technology. The marriage between the Microsoft suite and this technology means that with things like Copilot and Office integration around the corner, this will literally be on the desktop of all workers, practitioners, and students, and it's going to change very, very quickly, which is going to make it difficult to regulate. Now, let's just remind ourselves that AI should probably be put into at least 4 extreme quadrants for the purposes of this discussion. And the main division is whether we're leaving humans in the loop or we're taking humans out of the loop. If humans are in the loop and the task we're using the AI for is narrow, then I call that an assisted intelligence. If humans are in the loop and the task is more general purpose, like research, then this is augmented intelligence. If we take humans out of the loop and it's narrow, it's simply an automated intelligence. If we take humans out, if we take humans out of the loop and it's more general, then it's a more autonomous intelligence. As a tool or a set of tools, these forms of AI, which we call generative AI, which although they have become very popular since about November last year, have actually been bubbling away for a long time. There were earlier versions of generative pre-trained transformers that were nowhere near as powerful. There were other forms of generative AI, possibly starting with some of the deep learning reinforcement neural networks that allowed AlphaGo to beat Lee Sedol at Go now 5, 6, 7 years ago. I think it is up here in the top left, general purpose tasks, but with humans in the loop, where we are using them as an augmented intelligence, that there's enormous promise for us ultimately as a species, and specifically narrowing down into the research space. Let's consider also that any technology in and of itself is neither inherently good nor bad. It's what we do with it that counts. In fact, the real quote from Martin Kranzberg in his Laws of Technology was, technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So it's how we use it and how we petition its use and how we encourage its use and how we discourage other uses of it that's going to be the most important for the research sector. Take, for example, AlphaFold, which is what AlphaGo has morphed into. It now has solved for protein folding, an enormous open problem in biological research. And it is open sourced and it is available to researchers throughout not just the Australian education system, but globally. So we have at our disposal an open source tool gifted to the community to allow us to do research on protein folding and structures of protein with 100x efficiency over what was previously possible. This is enormous. This is an incredible thing. We have to cite that we are using these tools, but there is no denying that a tool like this is going to immensely benefit research. So too, generative pre-trained transformers, like ChatGPT, are essentially tools for compressing and working with incredibly large amounts of knowledge. Now, to have that at our fingertips can be incredibly powerful, but we also have to be aware of the risks that it introduces. And some of these risks are with any compression of knowledge that these AIs will hallucinate. They will basically make things up. Now, it's the next generation that are already starting to integrate fact checking, that are already starting to integrate plugins which allow you to, for example, link ChatGPT with something like Wolfram Alpha to be very reliant on the science behind the suggestions. And as models that essentially work out of the box in one direction only, in other words, there's no real memory, we're starting to link them with other tools and other plugins such as AutoGPT that allows them to actually go off and autonomously work on a task. So it's a very quickly moving landscape, and as such, shows enormous promise and can actually completely disrupt the research process. But on the other side of the coin, as with all AI, there's a new spectrum of risks being introduced. Risks around bias, risks around fairness, risks around transparency or explainability, risks around the robustness or security of these algorithms. And I think educational institutions are incumbent to understand and communicate those different risk profiles, and also to stay on top of the tools that work together with generative AI, which can do things like fingerprint, detect whether or not a generative AI has been used. And as we move into open source large language models and the ability to run these large language models inside institutions or ensure that they are fed only with the highest quality verified scientific research, to work with tools that will deliberately imprint a fingerprint. And when I talk about imprinting a fingerprint, I'm actually talking about the statistical distribution of words that is passed back from these tools. There are already many solutions that allow us to say that text was definitely generated by this generative AI. I think we mustn't discourage the use of this incredible tool, possibly the crowning achievement of our species in terms of tool development, but we also must encourage it to be done in a way that is transparent, able to be verified, used in tandem with humans to quote the research, to quote the source, to encourage the use of specific education and research-focused generative pre-trans transformers, which can very much have augmentation around the certainty of the results that are passed back to them, and above all else, to do so responsibly. And one of the main tenets of doing responsible AI is to have appropriate governance. So the right record keeping, the right fact checking and verification of the use of these tools. I hope that's a relatively balanced introduction to the space, and I'm interested to see where the conversation goes.
Thank you so much, Matt, and such big picture pieces to start the conversation with. Panelists, does anyone have a question for Matt? If so, just open up your video or I will take the first question. Matt, you're talking about governance here. What are your views on how we do govern something that is so ever evolving and with such potential? What is it do you think that we need to do?
So, Margaret, we need to do new things, but we also need to lean heavily on the past, in that we have successfully governed the introduction of new tools before, whether it's calculators replacing slide rules, whether it's spreadsheets replacing calculators, whether it's advanced statistical modeling packages in, let's say, an engineering research field, replacing more old-fashioned hand-done calculations or calculations done in spreadsheets, whether it's higher generation computer languages, automating and making more black box all the things that were previously transparent in more historical computational metrics, or even off my example of AlphaFold. There used to be research done with crystalline structure of proteins. It was very laborious, which can now be automated inside this open source protein folding algorithm. How would we, using the tools already at our disposal, govern and regulate that? Well, we'd probably require the version to be very clearly recorded, so that historically we can go back and say, oh, it's actually emerged that that version of AlphaFold had a bias towards protein folding. So I think we have many of the governance tools already at our disposal, being very clear about the source, being very clear about the data, being very clear about the ability to replicate an experiment. So random seeds are a big part of generative pre-trained transformers, and in fact, generative AI in general. There's a degree of randomness in the mix that means you won't get the same answer twice. However, there are switches and there are ways that you can use the software to say, I'm using this particular random seed, which guarantees replicability. So we should have guidelines that say it should be replicable. We must record the version. We must govern our use of data very carefully. But again, these aren't new ideas. They're just more important in the face of these rapidly accelerating technologies.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. Really useful to have those insights. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this talk is this whole panel is the diversity here. So thank you again. Our next speaker is Dr. Nitya Philipson, who's a co-convener of the Research Integrity SIG for the Australasian Research Management Society. And she has much experience with research ethics, integrity, and high-profile investigations into research misconduct. So a really different perspective. And Nitya is interested in the human side of research integrity. So over to you, Nitya.
Thanks so much, Margaret. I'm just going to quickly share some slides. Fantastic. Hopefully everyone can see that. Great. So thanks everyone, and thanks Matt for that wonderful introduction to genAI. And I swear we didn't collude on this, but I think I'm going to make many of the similar points to Matt that he made in his previous talk. But I'm coming to this very much from a research integrity lens. So my job at the Institute is to investigate complaints into poor conduct. It's to investigate research misconduct should it arise, and also to prevent that behaviour with education, training and tools. And so I'm going to come to this really looking at it through that integrity lens and talking about the use and potential misuse of generative AI in health and medical research, because that's the sector I work in. So very quickly, I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour of some potential uses in health and medical research. And I'm not an expert in this field, but certainly have been watching this area with interest. One of the key areas I feel that are emerging in the use of genAI in health and medical research is in the analysis of large data sets. We have plenty of those in our sector. And what we're increasingly seeing is genAI being used to analyse these data sets, to identify patterns and predict outcomes, to hopefully diagnose diseases and treatments. We're also seeing the technology being used to generate synthetic data sets. So we want to often perform really complex experiments on big models of data without the privacy concerns. So we're using AI to synthesize data to do that on. We're seeing it used to impute missing data sets into these large ones, as well as enhancing techniques such as medical imaging and drug discovery. And finally, with the emergence of more large language models, we're also seeing it used in the qualitative data space in facilitating thematic analysis. So people are putting their sort of survey data, their open text data into these tools as well. I think that's really specific uses of AI, although I've been relatively broad. I think what most of us are probably using GenAI to do is the research administration work that's associated with research. So we know people are using OpenGenAI in particular, like ChatGPT, to prepare our research outputs, to write manuscripts. I certainly use it from time to time to write a term of reference, a business case, some emails. Others are using it to write patient-facing material, grant applications. And we know increasingly that people are using the large language models to review their applications as a sort of peer review or pre-peer review process as well. So this is a very quick overview of some of the uses in health and medical research, but being in research integrity, of course, I'm going to focus on some potential misuses. And before I get into this, I want to say two things. The first is that I'm not here to discourage the use of AI. I like Matt, believe that this is an amazing advance in how we're doing research. But just to kind of talk about some of the emerging concerns that are happening in the space that I work in. And also to say that a lot of the potential misuses in health and medical research are very directly related to how we use them in the first place. So they're very much two sides of the same coin. So if we were to take the first area, which I think we need to be focusing on, and that is bias. So I've told you that GenAI is being used to analyze these really large data sets. And it does that by using, say, deep learning models to analyze these data sets. And these models are trained using training data. And unfortunately, what we've seen time and time again is that the data that's being used to train some of these models in health and medical research are very biased towards Western data sets. And that's called algorithmic bias. And that bias can be pretty devastating if left unchecked. So one example I wanted to give was a deep learning model that's an FDA-approved technology to detect skin cancers in photographs from patients. And this is an approved in-use model. And when it was examined how effective the deep learning model was, what they found was that it was actually 50% less effective in African-American patients. And that was because the training data that had trained this model didn't contain nearly enough of a representative sample of Black images. And that's really problematic, especially when we consider in the US that melanoma in African-American patients is a really leading cause of death and disease there. And so that's just one very, very brief example of potential bias in GenAI and its impacts on health and medical research. But it's not just related to race, and I could have given 20, 30, 40 examples. It's related to all elements of intersectionality, gender, economic status, you name it. And this is something that both personally and professionally I'm very concerned about, but also really I'm looking forward to working on to improve. The next area related to its use is the generation of synthetic data. So if we're saying that we can use GenAI to generate synthetic data to do bona fide research, it's not unreasonable to have concerns that it could be used to fabricate data sets. And we saw this in COVID with an entire database being fabricated in the Surgisphere scandal. I don't know if you can want to cast your mind back to that time, but that was an entire data set that was fabricated. and resulted in the halting of a number of clinical trials around the world into new COVID medications. So we definitely have some emerging concerns around fabrication too. It's also worth pointing out that we're a little bit nervous about data falsification and image manipulation, given that its current uses are very legitimate in imputing missing data and modifying images. And this is sort of how it used to look like at least a while ago now. This is a retracted Western blot study where we can see the author of this now retracted paper has just simply duplicated a band in their Western blot and spliced it into the image to prove their research hypothesis. And this is not that easy to detect already, but there are concerns that it's going to become harder to do. And I won't go too much into privacy. I think this is covered in the last seminar. I did watch the recording, but it's fair to say that ChatGPT or OpenGenAI is a bit of a privacy nightmare. So when researchers want to input sensitive health information about children, and that's who I work with, into these large language models, I get very, very nervous around the privacy issues. So then looking at the research administration side of things, Matt's already mentioned that, that these models can hallucinate, I think was the term you used, and generate some misinformation, although that's getting better, as you've already mentioned. We know that ChatGPT in particular is really good at faking citations, making up citations and misattributing citations as well. So we really need to take accountability for our research outputs. And if we're going to use technology like this, we really need to be careful around plagiarism and misinformation. And finally, confidentiality breaches. It's linked to the privacy side of things. But we know that if we're inputting sensitive information, maybe even information that's commercial in confidence, that we might be breaching confidentiality in some of our contractual obligations as well. And this is something that obviously the ARC had on their mind recently, with some concerns that the peer review that their reviewers were undertaking was actually being done by ChatGPT. And they moved swiftly to ban that. I think this is last week this came out. Citing confidentiality breaches as the kind of concern behind that. So the reason why I'm talking about this is because all of these amount to research integrity issues. So all of the things I've talked about can amount to a breach of the code. And if that breach is serious, negligent, persistent, it can be considered research misconduct. And I don't say this again to discourage or scare you, but just to raise to the forefront the issues that are there. So what do we need to do about it? Well, as Matt mentioned, we are used to this historically. We have been doing this, managing risks and benefits for a really long time. And we've been doing this for a long time in health and medical research, especially with really novel and emerging technologies. And we've managed that in the past by informing our consumers, our participants, adhering to ethical principles, regulatory frameworks, really reporting and disclosing on our work, and I think increasingly using open science to check the reproducibility of our work. And I think researchers should do the same with genAI. They should absolutely be informed about the benefits and risks, as Matt alluded to. We need to keep up to date with the ethical issues, policies and frameworks. And I think that's where organizations like Texa, like ARMS and my role come in. And that's to take the really emerging, and this is all from the last year, by the way, just a snapshot of some of the regulatory policies and to create guidance so that our researchers can act with integrity and according to best practice. We need to disclose how and when we use AI, and I want to disclose that I did sense check some of my slides through ChatGPT today, so I'm practicing what I preach. And I think we can increasingly look to open science practices to keep us honest. So we know that open data, open AI are emerging sort of really accelerating models of open science that I think will hopefully keep us on the straight and narrow too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nitya. And again, another really interesting perspective. Due to time, what I'm thinking I'm going to do, because I can see the Q&A is getting massive, I'm going to actually think I'm going to roll into the next presentation now. So please hold your questions for Nitya, and I'm going to move to the next panelist. This is Dr. Simon Knight, who is the Director of the Centre for Research on Education and Digital Society from UTS. And I think Simon's work is super interesting. It's super interdisciplinary. And for example, his recent work investigates how people learn to ethically navigate uncertainty, disagreement, and evidence. And I think that is really going to be where a lot of this sort of chat GPT questions are going to revolve. Simon, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Margaret. And thanks everybody for coming along today. So I'm going to talk about some work that I've been particularly doing over the last 6 months. And I have notes that I'm very happy to share with people, but they're not in a attractive slide form at the moment, so I'm not going to put any slides up. And over the last 6 months, I've been at UCL in London and the Digital Futures Project in Sweden, in Stockholm. And that's where some of the ideas from today have come from. So my thanks to them for hosting me for that period as well. And my real interest has been around the question of research ethics and the implications of AI. And then as the project developed and the buzz grew ever greater, genAI particularly for our practices. And for me, the question of what do researchers need to know about genAI, a significant part can be addressed through our existing national statement on ethics in human research, although it would apply beyond that to some extent. And the Australian national statement it's not distinctive in having this feature, but it is distinctive in the way it's expressed, having a fourth principle of merit and integrity. And this one seems to be sometimes under-recognized. And I would frame that principle as worth, as in, is this worthwhile? And the reason I'd frame it that way is that worth has two connotations. First of all, there's a value proposition. It says that we have some kind of shared idea of an outcome that we care about, that we value. But it also has a validity claim to it. Does it work? That we think that the thing we're proposing doing, the research or the instrument we want to use, will in fact achieve the outcome that we value. And so as we think about using AI and generative AI for our research and for researching how AI is being used across contexts as well, for me, we want to really center this question of worth and the role of evidence and rigor, which underpins our impact. It's why people work with universities. It's why the work that we do has importance in society. And so then the question becomes, well, what's distinct about the ethics of research that involves AI? And Matt and Nitya have given some really nice examples, particularly around the question of fairness and bias. And it is fair to say that in the context of generative AI, there isn't a huge amount of guidance that would be available for research contexts. And perhaps more concerningly, in some ways at the moment, the legal context is also unclear, and that will play out over a short period, but I'm sure there'll be questions for longer as well. And that presents a risk for researchers where if we use tools that have unclear legal grounding, potentially the value of that work will not hold over time. And in fact, potentially we would be liable for certain kinds of harm around intellectual property, particularly. Looking at the wider literature, there are, I think it's 185 AI ethics guidelines have been released over the last, I can't remember how many years, covered in, there've been 4 recent reviews of them. I have looked at most of them, and actually very few of them are guidelines. Many of them are sets of principles. Some of them provide strategy roadmaps for adoption of AI, but not particularly focused on the ethical concerns. And almost none of them relate to research purposes. And for me, that really matters because I'm very interested not in clear-cut cases where we may well see regulation fairly soon for some of those, or where, despite the fact some people still engage in these behaviors, they seem to be fairly obvious cases of problematic behavior, but in how we can navigate some of the more nuanced ethical dilemmas that we encounter as researchers and as educators all the time. And to do that, we need principles. So the national statement provides one of our sort of foundational documents for that. That gives us a shared language and values for navigating the space. But we also need cases, examples, particularly examples that help us to get at some of the thorny edge cases, and then strategies that help us to work out how we can navigate those spaces. So in the context of Texa particularly, assessments and the ways that assessment policies are developed provide us with material forms that we can work with, and they help us to work out what's appropriate here. What sorts of structures can we put in place to engage in ethical action? When we're thinking about the kind of distinct features that we face in genAI, we have those concerns around bias and fairness, the sort of data concerns, privacy certainly. But there's also a challenge around the sort of blurred lines that we have between stakeholders and their power relations. And I'm particularly thinking in social science research and education, which is my background, where we have commercial actors engaged, often with tools that it would be fair to describe as experimental, so research tools. Teacher-student relationships where we might be asking students who are also participants to engage with particular kinds of tools, genAI tools. And where in fact some of the people involved may be researcher practitioners, so co-researchers. Teachers often fulfill that role. And that creates different types of challenges that have been addressed in the education literature, but the connection of that to emerging technologies is not clear at the moment. And that's particularly problematic and I think complicated because, yes, we're seeing genAI being used by us in well-defined research contexts, but we're also seeing it used in naturalistic contexts and in secondary use of data where we want to understand what's happening there. And so again, we come back to this question of worth or merit and being able to understand the evidence for claims made about what genAI might be useful for and how it can be used over time and over context as well, because different settings will have different kinds of appropriate behavior. And so one thing that's we might think about, and I'm not clear what direction regulation will go, the ACCC last week released some guidance on greenwashing and companies expressing claims of sustainability that were not grounded in evidence. And I wonder whether or not one of the approaches that we'll see will be something similar in the space of genAI and other AI tools that are deployed across contexts where they make evidentiary claims and therefore there should be evidence underpinning them that underpins the worth of engagement with them. And I will leave things there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, and really interesting to think about the idea of evidencing what AI does and also that sort of case examples where the thorny issues are, because often it's very easy to say things, you know, in the very abstract sense or when things are really bad, but it's those grey things that are always interesting. So thank you so much to Simon. And as I said, I'm going to move us on to the last speaker to keep time for the, I don't know if panelists are out there, are 30 open questions and the top one has had 44 upvotes. So, and we've still got one speaker to go who I think is on a very popular topic. So Professor Justin's, and Justin, please may I say, how do I pronounce your surname? I should have asked this beforehand.
Well, I like rhyming it with a prize, personally.
Ah, Zobel, indeed. I got it right the first time. And may one of those prizes come your way, so you can say Zobel Nobel, is a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor in the School of Computing and Information Systems and a Pro Vice Chancellor, Graduate and International Research. And so has oversight for research training. And so I think it's really interesting to have someone like Justin who has a deep understanding of the technology and what it affords, but also a broad understanding of research and research training. Justin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Hopefully you can all see my screen. So I'm very grateful to my colleagues on the panel because they've helped me avoid saying a whole lot of introductory remarks about the technologies we're talking about. Obviously, what I'm talking about here in the next few minutes is our PhD candidates and how particular AI, I'm talking about generative AI in particular, affects their work. Other people have touched on other AI technologies such as AlphaGo and so on that designed for very specific kinds of analysis. I'm here to talk about text. And I want to contextualize this by not talking about technology, but by talking about humans, because we've got a very deep culture of what we think our doctorate and PhD candidates and so on should be learning while they're doing their study. Now, we, as people have intimated earlier, there's a bit of a groundswell out there saying, well, let's just blow it up. They don't need to learn these skills anymore because they're old hat, because ChatGPT has been out there for 8 months. I'm just going to foreshadow that I'm standing at the oppositional side to this. I'm not keen on this technology, and I'll go through why. But standing in our existing world where we're training HDRs because this world is facing a blistering array of challenging problems, and we want to create the brightest researchers across every discipline to solve those problems. And that's the basic goal. And we want them to have deep knowledge. We want them to be able to explain the complexities and subtleties of their thought to us. We want them to understand what's going on, as well as do the work, which I'm not touching on here. And they do this, and they're not like our undergraduate students who might, defeat an assignment by using ChatGPT to generate an essay or what have you, but they're communicating all the time. Annual reviews, doing analysis of texts, writing to their supervisors, generating research results. And as a Dean of Graduate Studies or equivalent, I'm deeply concerned by the idea that people will simply outsource these tasks to generative AI. And where I'm coming from is the very well understood psychological perspective that writing can help you think. The struggle with writing requires a whole lot of forms of attention that don't arise in other settings, and lets you set out very complex ideas that are amorphously held in the mind and make them concrete. There are lots of older writing on this topic, but lots of very good evidence as well. So here's a very brief article that's easily found online, but I want to expand there a little bit, and I'll read from the slide, which I know is always terribly bad practice, but writing about something drives understanding of that something. Learning and retention are dependent on effort. If people are not forced to engage deeply with a written task or a reading task, they don't recall it. It's just very clear that people need to go through that iterative process of learning to express themselves to become fluent in the knowledge of the field and fluent in being able to be in the field. And we will, all supervisors will have seen their PhDs proceeding from struggling for 2 days to write a 100-word abstract to tossing one off in 10 or 15 minutes by the time they have become that competent research thinker. And clearly where I'm going here is the contention that ChatGPT undermines that learning and retention. If we're doing cognitive offloading to another tool, if I read somebody else's bit of writing and understand that bit of writing, great, but I won't retain that understanding if I'm not engaged with it. I'm also really concerned that the role of the supervisor is in some sense a very intimate one, that you work closely with that candidate, you get a very nuanced sense of where their capabilities and gaps are, and you mentor them. You work through the things that they are less capable at doing and help them to improve and to understand why their understanding is weak. If you're receiving material from them that's not theirs, of course, that's going to be undermined. A colleague of mine used the analogy that, you don't become fit by getting your friend to do your gym training for you, and writing and thinking and expressing are all brain gym. Obviously, examinations undermined. We want to understand what the candidate can and can't do. And I'm going to stand up against a couple of remarks made by my panel members earlier, in that ChatGPT is actually a narrow AI. People treat it as if it's very broad and very capable, but it is so often wrong when you ask for some detailed piece of information. And we talk about it accessing knowledge, but it is not accessing knowledge. It's accessing text, strings of letters, roughly, the size of 10,000 or 100,000 massive libraries, truly vast volumes of text, and is doing pattern matching effectively into that text after abstracting it into an internal form. The words are lost, but the abstracted form is retained. There is no knowledge base to a tool like ChatGPT. It's just patterns of text being regurgitated in response to a prompt. And treating it as knowledge is the wrong magisterium. It's there are databases of knowledge, and there are repositories. It is possible to extract knowledge unreliably from research papers and other text sources, but we're not doing that when we interact with ChatGPT. It feels like a dialogue with all of human knowledge, but it's actually something more basic and less general, and I think its capability is deeply misleading. We've published guidelines for our graduate researchers that talk about general digital assistance tools, editing tools, all sorts of other things, but of course generative AI is an important part of that. And the key principle we've gone for, and I won't do this in detail, but that link is a public link, is that this has to be done in an open and frank way. If you're using a tool, your supervisor needs to know, and they need to know when you can't do something, and that use of the tool will explain that. So I'm going to reflect. There's an image of complacency. I think we have been very complacent for a very long time. Generative AI has sort of brought that complacency forward. We've been struggling with detection of plagiarism and academic misconduct for a long time. The internet, the web, and the range of technologies that emerged have all empowered that. But for me, an absolutely critical takeaway is that people who think they're learning something by using AI to create materials are kidding themselves, and they're kidding the people around them, and that is not going to end well at the point either of graduation or beyond, where we need people to have that knowledge to be able to do these critical things we expect. I'd also like to go off topic just for a very last slide and raise another concern that reflects what one has heard a little bit in public discussions, radio or talkback. We are already in an era where there are tremendous concerns about the integrity of science. And I cannot guess, but I can hypothesize what will happen if a political party in power that's antithetical to research decides, well, we don't need this science anyway because AI will do it for us with just a few people piloting along beside. It's a tremendous risk, I think, to the future of our enterprise. So I will stop there with an actual photograph of the panel and return to Margaret.
Am I the blue Smurf? Is that my
You are the Smurf.
designation? Thank you.
Papa Smurf.
Thank you so much. Really interesting to have that sort of end on a note of public trust. And I think it comes down to, what happens when you have these conversations is when we talked about teaching and learning, you ended up in very quickly saying, what is the role of higher education? What is the role of teaching and learning to the nation, to people? And I think we end up in this place here. What is the role of research and how does that happen? And the other, what does it mean, I should say? What does it mean to the public at large, to ourselves, to our society? And the other thing I think we saw clearly here is that research training is really interesting because it is both education and research and has to fulfill both roles at once. So I'd invite the whole panel to open up their video, whatever the word is, show themselves to the world for questions. And I think what we'll do is we'll try and get through some few questions, and then what I might do is end with a little bit of commentary from everyone and everything they've heard. So the first question, which came very early on, and I think probably will be for Justin, but I think others may have views, is how can we advise research students where and how to use generative AI as a research tool when we cannot yet know how examiners will view this? And this also ties to another question about how will generative AI developments affect the HDR examination process. So examining, and this has 49 upvotes, by the way, so it's a very popular question.
I really wish there was a clean answer to that question because it's one we've been grappling with an awful lot. In that, as my talk makes clear, I don't think I'm old school. I've been a computer science technology developer for over 40 years, but I'm a huge advocate of learning the basic skills. You don't learn to do carpentry by building flat pack furniture, by making people use those skills to make sure they're refined. Where I would be using it is, for example, letting people get a sense of the compare and contrast. Here is how generative AI might describe your problem or your data. What is wrong? How would you do it? What would you bring back to the table? You have a go first. Okay, let's have an iteration with it. So not quite a co-pilot, but as a sort of mentoring adjunct in combination with a supervisor. Clearly, other tools, data interpretation is a classic one. AI is getting very mature, and AIs can discover things that a human will never discover through pattern in the data. But it is discovering pattern, not necessarily pattern that's grounded in truth. So again, they're tools for probing data, but not necessarily for being the final word. So it's as co-pilot and as a development of critical faculties, but for me, it isn't part of the mainstream of how they will work at the moment.
Any other comments on examination for HDR? No, no.
Margaret, I did want to frame, and I'm really interested in your point of view, Justin, as expressed, not losing sight of how quickly not just generative AI, but all of these technologies are evolving. standing on the shoulders of giants, large language models bootstrapping other large language models, which can lead into some real issues as well with synthetic data being used to generate more synthetic data. But I'm more focused on where this field will sit in a year in terms of the ability to be pretty sure that's not a hallucination, that it's accurately cited and it's accurately reflected. With feedback loops between generative AI technologies and more robust and dependable AI or other analytic technologies, I think very quickly moves away from many of the downsides. I also think there's certainly an attitude of, these tools are not only here to stay, but going to be accelerating so very quickly. We need new paradigms. Once upon a time, we might have encouraged people not to be lazy spellers. We now kind of accept that spell check is a useful and meaningful tool for them. So it's a really interesting challenge when we're trying to put in place guidelines and regulations in the face of something that's moving so very, very quickly and morphing as it merges with other technologies to create a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts.
If I could try a responsive sentence, and I think it's just one. The critical thing about PhD exam is that it's about the person. It's not about the research they do. It's not about the technical outcomes. It's about their capability. And use of technologies as part of the materials they submit is a barrier to assessment of the individual. Lots of universities within Australia are moving to oral examination for PhDs, where there's about 25 universities in the world that don't use oral examination. It's a tiny number. So for me, that really has to be core, that we're going back to the old Don and Minions model of how people become evaluated.
I'll jump in. I do think, having been involved in some European supervisions recently and seeing how the defence unfolds, that it is can be a bit grueling, but it is enormously developmental to actually have to debate your work with that. And I think what is really interesting, I'm going to jump in here around the examination front and a little bit on those last comments. I think those things that you described, Matt, would be are more relevant outside of the research field. When you're dealing with research, you're actually pushing beyond places have been before. And I noticed in the chat there's a lot of talk about literature reviews. I mean, there's sometimes literature reviews, for example, can be, and I'm going to put genAI to one side. A research assistant can do a literature review for you. Sometimes it's not what you need. You actually need to do the literature review yourself because you need to understand what's within it. And although I'm hesitant, for all the reasons you described, Justin, to anthropomorphize genAI too much, at the same time, there's also a touchstone for me. If I wouldn't ask someone else to do my work as a researcher, because, that's the stuff that I have to contribute, I'm probably not going to want to give it to genAI either. I mean, with some caveats and exceptions, etc. So I do think in some ways in research training, we're lucky because we're asking to test things. We're not asking students to do things that is already within that body of knowledge that's already there. We're asking them to push the boundaries. So we have some advantages when it comes to examination. And Lucinda, to your question, I think that having reviewed lots of different examination protocols, supervising a lot of different universities, that I think we can do it in regulations. It's surprising how different all the examination regulations are. Like, they're crazily different. So I guess this is going to be another one of those multitudes of differences to add into the field. Sorry, now the blue Smurf is taking over. Let me go to the next question, which is about lit reviews. And I've answered that a little bit, but I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say. How can we differentiate, for instance, lit review made by human and by AI? Because there's so many AI tools, Cite AI, Consensus, etc., that can do lit review instantly. How can we promote responsible use of AI, and how can we promote authenticity, or should we redefine authenticity? So I'm going to start off with you, Simon, and then maybe Nietzsche after that.
So I'm super excited, particularly about Elicit. Having played with that set of tools, I think the idea of being able to ask questions of sets of resources that you have is fantastic. It has the advantage that from some experimental, not formal experimental, just testing, it doesn't seem to hallucinate responses either. But all of those systems will suffer from one key issue, which is the copyright problem. As academics, we give away our copyright to publishers unless we're publishing open access. And so tools like Elicit will only be able to use Semantic Scholar is the most common one. And it's a really small subset of all of the literature available. Yes, at some point, we may be able to run it over our own corpora. We can't at the moment. And even then, when we get access to published works via the library, there are conditions on that access. And so there may still be restrictions on our ability to use the tools for those purposes. So there's just some very pragmatic constraints that limit their use, especially at the moment, that it's not clear how they'll be overcome or when.
Great, thank you. Nitya, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think I think there's so many points that have been said so far. I really like the idea of AI supporting research work in a way that's ethical and, of course, responsible. And I, really take on board Justin's points around the act of learning. But I think it is worth reflecting, and maybe this is an unpopular viewpoint, that the model we operate in right now isn't just about purely the pursuit of knowledge. We have commodified research and higher education, and we need to be really honest, I think, about that, and then look at the use of those tools in the context of that evolvement, and say to ourselves, we want to turn higher education back to being about a pursuit of knowledge, or research back to that. How can we do that in a way that then supports the use of these tools, rather than just saying, I just think it's about grounding us in the reality of where we are right now. And I don't know if that's a very popular opinion. And my second commentary would be, I love the idea of using Elicit too, Simon. I've used it a bit, but I think it's going to really perpetuate the bias around access to literature that's very Western-centric. And I think, again, we should just be really cognizant of that with any of these tools as well.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And I'm going to throw the next question to you in a moment, Nitya, which will be the one about a digital divide. But I just also wanted to say the first cases about copyright are starting to come through the courts. I don't know if anyone's been following. Novelists have sued OpenAI, two popular novelists who sued OpenAI for inappropriate use of their copyright in the US. So we will see where that lands. Nitya, I'm going to there's a very broad question. I'm going to skip down that to this question, but we'll come back to the one above. Could any of the panelists share their thoughts on whether the implementation of generative AI in academic research might widen the digital divide or create a new form of inequality among researchers and institutions globally, or does it create a level playing field for all? And I'll get you to start, Nitya, and then I might open up to everyone else.
I'd say the jury's still out, but I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel on that. For me, it's been really nice to be able to access documents in other languages and use genAI to translate that in a way that I wouldn't have maybe been able to do before. But given the kind of core of my presentation is that these training models are being fed Western data sets, then and the underrepresentation is still happening and perhaps being exacerbated, I'd say the jury's out, but and maybe I don't know, maybe that's the better answer.
Justin.
The question of bias, which Nitya raised so accurately, is a really interesting one, because I think I had assumed for a long time that these kind of engines and AI learning tools tended to reflect their input data, but I think that's not correct. I think they actually amplify the differences in their input data. So instead of there being a 60-40 imbalance, let's say, between men and women in leadership positions in the workforce, every example that gets generated of a leader in the workforce is a man when you start interrogating these things. And I think these things also apply across cultures. There's a bias to thinking that great research or fabulous knowledge or great literatures in English, because English has become such a dominant language of research and education globally. So I know I'm not really answering the question, but I think these tools do worsen the problem, and they're, the problems of fair and unbalanced information retrieval or search just are unaddressed. We've had research on them for 10 years directly on these topics, or 12 years, with very little progress. So I do remain very concerned.
Matt?
Yeah, the diversity is great. I am very excited. I think we need to think forward to a world which is very close, where this isn't an open AI ChatGPT discussion, but rather a discussion of technologies that they have heralded, that were previously unattainable because of the enormous compute, where there are now solutions to make them much more attainable. And think of a higher education version of a large language model that is purely fed only on the highest quality peer review papers from all around the world and all the universities. We need to think forward to a world where the algorithmic tests for bias and fairness that are challenging but not impossible, and have already been solved for other types of difficult and convolutional forms of neural networks and AI, are now readily applicable to large language models with benchmarks. And these tools are already well into their development, right? There's a way to actually measure and express and test bias through these models. I also think, in terms of a great democratizer, the research students that didn't have access to the same amount of research assistance, but still wanted to plow through enormous corpuses of text and have them efficiently summarized for them. Yes, it's not going to be perfect, but it's now an option that wasn't previously available. The same as back to high school, you now have a patient tutor ready to talk you through that maths or chemistry problem that previously was only the domain of wealthy children who could afford a great tutor or a great private school. So I actually see it as an enormous democratizer for all forms of research. And there's another use which we haven't really discussed, where if you look at generative AI for art, and it's got an understanding of what is a Picasso, and it's got an understanding of what is some modern artist, but something only it can do algorithmically is mash those two together and get something completely novel. Now, for inspiration and deliberately turning up the temperature and the hallucinations in a model, when you're at a loggerheads of research and you actually want some pretty off the wall ideas, you can use them to just generate that first instance of completely novel and new directions by merging together existing things you're considering in a way that only this algorithm is capable of doing, to give you some hints, some ideas of ways to go down your research pathway that you might have otherwise not obtained without the technology.
Can I make a quick counterpoint about that? Sorry, Matt, and I agree. I think knowing that there's bias in your system isn't enough. We've known now for 30 years that pulse oximeters don't work on me. But we haven't done anything in 30 years to change that. So I think knowing isn't enough. It's about creating a groundswell, a push to implement change once we know things are biased. So how do we do that? This is my question back to the panel, I guess, but one for another time.
Got to start with agreeing the measurement though, right? We've got to measure it to be able to change it and look at our progress against it.
But that means that you think that everything is measurable, which I won't debate too hard now, because we'll get in a very slippery slope. Simon, over to you.
You got to start with the question of what's worth doing and what values do we have. Measurement might come from that, but that's the fundamental question, and that's the question that's not addressed through some of the approaches to bias and fairness, I think, where there's a fantastic paper, and I've forgotten the name of the authors. It's a satire. I think it was published at CHI or CSCW, and it's about the ethical development of an aged person mulching machine. And it walks through the application of an ethics framework to developing this machine to mulch at random, but fairly, elders to be created as compost or whatever. And it's the distinction between doing things ethically, so we follow these procedures, and doing ethical things, engaging in actually tackling those challenges that we've known about for 30 years and longer, and so on. And with respect to the literature question and representation, my answer is basically the same as the last question, that at the moment, access to the two research literature is so restricted anyway. And, we experience that even in our very privileged positions, or I certainly do. There's lots of articles that I try and access that are behind paywalls that I'm not going to be able to get. And that's a real minority for me, but it's not for lots of other people around the world. And that will impact what people can apply to that data using tools like this, unless, again, they're using just the semantic scholar data, which is small.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And I think lots of thoughtiness, which I think is good. And if I have to say one Pollyanna thing, maybe not quite as sunny as Matt, but, is that I think that OpenAI is, generative AI is casting a light on these issues. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily agree that bias can be measured, because it's something that's socially constructed, and so it's very difficult to get a handle on what it is. Like, bias is biased, if you see what I mean. So even our measurement of it has to, anyway. But what this conversation is doing, I hope, would say, the practices we already have are flawed. Why do things not work? Why are they stalled? And if we're amplifying what is bad, maybe it will actually stop them from being hidden and raise them up a bit. That's my slightly the sun is shining view on this. I'll move now. We've got a few nuts and bolts questions. If researchers use OpenAI tools to analyse data gathered with participants, either qualitative or clinical, doesn't that constitute a breach of integrity? The data is being shared beyond the scope of approved research, unless improved in ethics applications. This raises the issue of what ethics reviews might need to consider from now on in terms of data sets and their use in analytics. And what are the, an associated question, what are the ethical implications of sharing qualitative data from research subjects with genAI tools? I'll pass to you first, Nietzsche, because I think these really sit in your bailiwick.
Yeah, so of course, if you're doing research out of or analysis outside of what's been ethically approved, then yes, it's a breach of the code and a research integrity issue. So I think the shift is going to be getting our PhD students to think about the tools they're going to be using and to build that into their ethics applications. And more importantly for me, the information and consent statements. So we're really informing our patients about what we're doing. And making sure that they consent to that happening. I think there are also tools out there that don't have such leaky privacy concerns. So we could also just use better tools. And what was the last part? Sorry, about the ethics.
Now, I of course said the question was answered, and I have lost it.
But we need to upskill our ethics committees too to consider the work in this, and that's something I know the Australian Health Research Ethics Committees are looking to do. So we know we need to do this better.
Yeah.
If I could,
when Sam spoke, sorry, you go, Sam.
If I can come in, sorry, Matt. There's the closely related issue that if I saw a patent application that I wanted to take down, and I suspected that a current tool that required uploading the confidential content to the tool had been used at any point in the pipeline, there's a good chance that patent would be invalidated. I'm not a lawyer, I'm just saying, but that the current tools like ChatGPT retain the prompts, they retain the information that's uploaded to them, and that would be a likely confound. So that sits next to the confidentiality matter, but very much in the same space. Sorry, Matt.
No, not at all. I just saw Sam Altman field this question when he was in Melbourne a few weeks back. I guess the first thing which it's it's really important. Everyone's aware, and I'm sure most people are. ChatGPT out of the box was frozen in time with knowledge at September 21, and anything we type into it isn't automatically added that other people can then search. However, it is available to the OpenAI servers unless, and this was Sam's very terse response, you click on the ellipse next to your name, one click away is to switch off retaining data. Now, do we believe him? I think we'd be in a very sad position if we couldn't. But it is actually incredibly easy to turn ChatGPT for something that retains training data to something that it's only current for that session. And if it is only current for that session, and it's not retained in any logs or any other places within the environment, then I think it poses less risk than possibly using a Google Sheet or even possibly Office 365 online. Anything that's now cloud-based, by virtue of putting data into it, is somewhere retaining it. And GPT, this incarnation of it, makes it very easy to say, you cannot retain that. In which case, do we still have the privacy issue of using it to get information or feedback on personal data?
These times like these, you actually really want a lawyer on the panel, because a lot of the challenges being faced here are really boiled down to quite complex legal issues. And every time I try and think about it, I end up at the same point, that I think that not only do we not know, the legislation's not well set up, and the courts themselves are making decisions that perhaps they're not necessarily well set up to make either. Nietzsche, you're about
Yeah, if a participant consents to that and we feel like we've explained the risks and benefits of that approach, then I agree. If it's not being made, if it's got the same kind of cyber controls or privacy controls as other data analysis tools, which we use all the time in qualitative research, then I don't see a distinction from that. I think it's just going to be about community standards and what their expectations around how their data is being used, and that's going to be the challenge rather than specific privacy legislation.
Yeah, and because you do need to consent to the use. I mean, that's the key. The key issue is anything we do with the data that you give us, you need to consent to. I'm going to move to another research training question. Given that AI will inevitably become embedded in the research process, what skills training career trajectory should we be exploring for ourselves and students?
Prompt engineer.
Wow. What a, sorry, I've jumped in because that was research training, but did you want to go, Matt? No.
Not at all.
Such an open question. I mean, when we all have hover cars, what will that do to commuting practice? It's very incredibly open. I think for a long time as a nation, and with the exception of North Korea, which has been fabulous at digital education right from early primary school, by the way, have lagged in giving people digital skills and understanding of the technologies they deal with. And I see this on a day-to-day basis when I ask people a very simple question: what's the difference between the web and the internet? And so many people fail that test. And it's the technology we all use. We know the difference between a car and a railway line. Why do we not know the difference between these two things? So I think there's an early stage answer is that there's a lot of digital education and digital awareness and digital understanding and full use of amazing tools. And I'm right back to spreadsheets, which people use in such a basic way when they can be used so richly, right through to making sure that people know the repertoire of tools that's currently available, and that's going to be very shifting landscape. Know where to use them appropriately and effectively, know when to not trust them, know what their limitations and weaknesses are, and then the career will shape itself. And there's an old statistic that something like 70% of people my age are working in professions that didn't exist when we were born. It's very hard to predict quite what these careers will look like in a few years' time.
Fantastic. And I think the one thing that we need to do is keep the dialogue open, because, you know, I think, Nietzsche, it was you who made the point, or others have made the point, that this is you know, the world, it's not, we can't just take this off in isolation. It's about commodification of HDR degrees. It's about, you know, the pushback against that. It's about a whole geopolitical system in which, you know, we're embedded, a social issue. I'm going to ask all panelists for their final thoughts. There's this big, broad question here. How might the introduction of AI-generated content impact on how we approach research and authentic research practices? I thought that was a very large question, but I thought it would frame a sort of final reflection. Or maybe let's put it very simply. What's the one thing that you think a researcher should need to know right now? So let's go in the order that you talked. Matt, I'll give you the first word, and Justin, I'll give you the last. Matt, what would be your
one thing that I think a researcher needs to know now about generative AI?
Or a one thing. It doesn't need to be the one thing.
Yep. I think it's we are writing the story. Be the change you want to see. You are actually, in your use of it and declaring your use of it and being aware of the potential biases in it, but also highlighting the opportunities and how it's helped you. We're forging the way to a very, very large extent. And I think outside of the topic of your research, you're actually participating in probably the second great AI experiment on society, the first being social media, which we failed horribly. So as an active participant in that research, do your best, because in and of itself, it's not good nor bad, but nor is it neutral.
Choose your own adventure. That's the story here. Fantastic. Nietzsche.
Yeah, so the one thing I want researchers to know is that they need to know that this is part of their business now, is to really educate and inform themselves on this. This can't be left to other people to do for you. The university says the tool's okay, I can go ahead and use it. You need to invest time and energy in understanding how these tools work, because they are a big disruptor, but they're also got so many potential benefits as well. So you need to know. Is my message.
So choose your own adventure, but you have to choose an adventure. You're on the adventure.
Yes.
Simon.
To continue the trend, I guess. I mean, mine would be that the rules haven't changed, and so that requires thinking about how we apply the values and sets of principles that we have available and learn to navigate them in a new context. So yeah, we're forging the way, but it's our responsibilities as individuals and as research collectives then to think about that learning, support it in society, and we have established principles and approaches for doing a lot of that.
Fantastic. Justin.
I'm going to use a word that other people have used, authenticity. That the critical thing to focus on, skills that you believe you need and the skills that you're acquiring, and to understand how these tools can augment those skills or help you develop those skills. But, and of course, I'm talking about HDR here. That you establish that you are genuinely learning, and then use those tools in defined and careful ways to make sure that you are learning well.
Wonderful. What a wonderful note to end on. Well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. So what a wonderful discussion, really thought-provoking and really covered a lot of ground. And I feel like the chat and the Q&A really reflects that the enthusiasm with which people are participating reflects the quality of the thinking and the conversation here. And I'm really hopeful that we can continue on with these conversations, because I do think it is moving onwards, and we have, as researchers, duties to ourselves and duties to our students to help them develop in the best ways possible. And I don't think, honestly, we could have a more authentic note than the conversation that we've had between the five of us. Very generative, to use that other word as well too. But possibly not at all artificial. Very intelligent too. Well, thank you very much to the end of all, and thanks to Texa as well for hosting, for hosting and supporting this event. And I really look forward to talking with you all in the future. Thank you.